Chapter 21. Discussing Ways and Means of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 21. Discussing Ways and Means. In good measure prepared for some such result, in case their expectations should prove true, friendly hands at once closed upon the exile, hurrying him back and still more completely under cover as quickly as might be. Cooper Edgecombe seemed as wax in their hands, not utterly deprived of consciousness, but rather like one dazed by some totally unexpected blow. He made not the slightest resistance, yielding to each impulse given, shivering and weak as one just rallying from an almost mortal illness. Yet there came an occasional flash to his eyes which warned the wary professor of impending trouble, and as quickly as might be the stunned aeronaut was removed from the point of observation, taken by short stages back to the spot where rested the flying machine. Ixtli seemed something awed by this, to him, inexplicable conduct on the part of the gaunt-limbed stranger, but gave his new-found friends neither trouble nor cause for worry, bearing them company and even lending a hand whenever he thought it might be needed. The Gillespie brothers were far more deeply stirred, as was natural, but even Waldo contrived to keep a fair guard over his at times unruly member, speaking but little during that retreat. With each minute that elapsed, Cooper Edgecombe gained in bodily powers, and while his mental strength was slower to respond, that proved to be a blessing rather than otherwise. The rendezvous was barely gained ere he gave a hoarse cry of reviving memory, then strove to break away from that friendly care, calling wildly for his wife, his daughter, fancying them in some dire peril from which alone his arms could preserve them. It was a painful scene as well as a trying one, that which followed closely, and respite only came after bonds had been applied to the limbs of the madman, for such Cooper Edgecombe assuredly was, just then. There were tears in the professor's eyes as he strove hardest to soothe the sufferer, assuring him that his loved ones should be restored to his arms, yet repeatedly reminding him that any rash action taken then must almost certainly work against their better interests. The exile grew less violent, but that was more through physical exhaustion than aught else, and what had, from the very first, appeared a difficult enigma, now looked far worse. Only when fairly well assured that the sufferer would not attract unwelcome attention their way through too boisterous shouting, did the professor draw far enough away for quiet consultation with his nephews. Mr. Edgecombe was deposited within the air ship, secured in such a manner that it would be well nigh impossible for him to do either himself or the machine material injury, no matter how violent he might become, and hence, in case of threatened trouble from the inmates of the lost city, flight would not be seriously hindered through caring for him. Professor Featherwit now gleaned from his nephews pretty much all they could tell him concerning sights and events since his departure in quest of the exile. That proved to be very little more than he had already learned, and contained still less which seemed of especial benefit to that particular enigma awaiting solution. True, Waldo suggested that Ixtli be employed as a medium of communication between the Sun Children and themselves, but possibly because, as a rule, this irrepressible youngster's ideas were generally the wildest and most far-fetched imaginable, Uncle Phaeton frowned upon the plan. No, the young Aztec might prove true at heart, even as indications went, but the risk of so trusting him would prove far too great. "That's just because you haven't known and slept with him like we have," declared Waldo. "He's red on the outside, but he's got just as white a soul as the best of us, bar none." Bruno likewise appeared to think well of the young brave, and suggested an amendment to Waldo's motion, that he accompany Ixtli into the sunken valley, covered by the friendly shades of night, there to open communication with the Sun Children. By so doing, we could make certain of their identity, the young man argued earnestly. That, it appears to me, is the first step to be taken, for in spite of the apparent recognition by Mr. Edgecombe, it is possible that no actual relationship exists. What of that? Bluntly cut in the younger Gillespie. Don't you reckon strangers would like to take a little walk just as well as any other people? Patience, my lad, interposed the professor. While we seem in duty bound to lend aid and assistance to women in actual distress, we can only serve them with their own free will and accord. Granting that the women we saw upon the teocalli were other than those believed by our afflicted friend. But, uncle, look at their names, and don't Ixtli say, well, tell 'em all over again, partner, won't you? Urged Waldo, taking a burning interest in the matter, as was his custom when fairly involved. The young Aztec complied as well as lay within his power, giving it as his fixed opinion that sore trouble, if not actual peril, awaited the children of the sun, unless assisted by powerful friends. He spoke of the mighty chieftain, Prince Hua, and of the high priest, Tlacopa, who was, to all seeming, playing directly into the hands of the Tzin. He say, Mother of Gods, call loud. He say sacrifice, and that no, Quetzal send, Quetzal save, must save Victor Glady. Further questioning resulted in but little more information, though, as Ixtli grew calmer, he emphasized such statements as he had already made, elaborating them a trifle, and by this his questioners learned that, humanly speaking, the fate of the sun god's children depended almost entirely upon the whim or fancy of the chief Paba of the teocalli. Through Tlacopa issued the awesome oracles, and when his voice thundered forth the dread fiat, who dared to openly rebel? Further questioning brought forth one more important fact, that there was absolutely no hope of either Victo or Glady coming forth from the valley, either by night or by day. While ostensibly free of will as they were of limb, neither woman was permitted to leave yonder temple save under armed escort, and guards were on duty each hour of the day and night. But we could get to see and speak with them, Ixtli? Asked Bruno, eager to reach some fair understanding as to the future course of action. Yes, white brother, go with Ixtli, came the hesitating reply, but then the Aztec caught one of Gillespie's hands, holding it in close contrast to his own brown paw, shaking his head doubtingly. No like. Keen eye dem people. Watch close. Find another white skin bad. You hear that, Bruno? Asked the professor, really relieved at such positive evidence in conflict with the rash proposition made by the young man. Of course I thought of going under cover of the night, uncle, and surely it would not be such a difficult matter to darken my face and hands, with dirt if nothing better can be found, and if I wore the clothes you brought from the cavern, Uncle Phaeton. That's the ticket, broke in Waldo eagerly. Why, in a rig like that I could turn the trick my own self. The consultation was broken off at this juncture by a faint summons from Cooper Edgecombe, and Professor Featherwit was only too glad of the excuse, hurrying over to the flying machine, finding to his great joy that the exile was now far more like his old-time self. Still, great caution was used in revealing all, and it was not until considerably later in the day that Mr. Edgecombe felt capable of taking part in the discussion of ways and means. He declared that his recognition had been complete in spite of the long years which had elapsed since losing sight of his dear ones, and he earnestly vowed to never give over until their rescue was effected, or he had lost his life while making the attempt. While the two air voyagers were thus engaged in talk, Bruno silently stole away with Ixtli, taking a bundle along, and leaving Waldo to throw their uncle off the track in case his suspicions should be prematurely awakened. Then, side by side, two Indian braves silently approached the aerostat, causing Professor Featherwit to make a hasty dive for his dynamite gun to repel a fancied onslaught. "Sold again, and who comes next?" merrily exploded Waldo, dancing about in high glee, as the supposed redskin slowly turned around for inspection before speaking in familiar tones. "Would there be such an enormous risk of discovery, Uncle Phaeton, provided I put lock and seal upon my lips, save for the ladies?" That experiment proved to be a complete success, and after Cooper Edgecombe added his pathetic pleadings to the young man's own arguments, Professor Featherwit gradually gave way, though still with reluctance. "I could never find forgiveness should harm come to your mother's son boy," he huskily murmured, his arm stealing about Bruno's middle. "I'd far rather venture myself, and why not, pray?" as Waldo burst into an involuntary laugh. Then he turned upon Ixtli, a hand resting upon each shoulder, while he gazed keenly into those lustrous dark orbs for a full minute in perfect silence. Then he spoke, slowly, gravely. "Can we trust you, friend? Would you sell the boy to whose arm you owe your own life unto his enemies? Would you lead him blindly to his death, Ixtli, son of Azotl?" A wandering gaze, then the Indian appeared to flush hotly. He shook off those far from steady hands, drawing his knife and with free fingers tearing open his dress above the heart. Thrusting the weapon into Bruno's hand, he spoke in clear, distinct accents. "Strike hard, white brother! Open heart! See if all black!" Eye to eye, the two youths stood for a brief space in silence, then the weapon was let fall, and Bruno gripped the Indian's hand and shook it most cordially. "Strike you, Ixtli? I'd just as soon smite my brother by birth." "And that's mighty right, too!" cried Waldo impetuously. "I really begin to believe that you are all in the right, while I alone am left in the wrong," frankly admitted the professor. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22. A Daring Undertaking of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 22. A Daring Undertaking. Still, that point was of too vital importance to justify hasty decision, and the professor did not make his surrender complete until the shades of another night were beginning to gather over the land. Meantime, partly for the purpose of keeping the youngsters employed, and thus out of the way of less harmless things, the professor suggested that the huge grizzly be flayed. If the proposed scheme should really be undertaken, that mighty pelt, if uncomfortable to convey, would serve as a fair excuse for the young brave's as yet unexplained absence from the lost city. As a matter of course, Cooper Edgecombe felt intense anxiety through all, but he contrived to keep fair mastery over his emotions, readily admitting that he himself could do naught towards visiting the lost city. "I know that my loved ones are yonder. I would joyfully suffer 10,000 deaths by torture for the chance to speak one word to them. And yet, I know any such attempt would prove fatal to us all. The mere sight of... I could go crazy with joy." There is no necessity for repeating the various arguments used, pro and con, before the final agreement was reached. Enough has already been put upon record, and the result must suffice. Professor Featherwit yielded the vital point, and having once fairly expressed his fears and doubts, flung his whole heart into perfecting the disguise which was now counted upon to carry Bruno safely into and out of yonder city. He was carefully trigged out in the warlike uniform secured by Cooper Edgecombe at the cost of a human life, and with fresh stain applied to his face and hands, the slight moustache he wore was not dangerously perceptible. "'Twould take a strong light and mighty keen eyes to see it at all, and even if a body should happen to notice it, he'd reckon 'twas a bit of smut or the like," generously declared Waldo. Under less trying circumstances, Bruno might have answered in kind, but now he merely smiled at the jester, then turned again to receive the earnest cautions let fall for his benefit by the professor. Above all else he was to steer clear of fighting, and without he saw a fair chance of winning speech with the white women, he was to keep in such hiding as Ixtli might furnish, trusting the young Aztec to post the Children of the Sun as to what was in the wind. Tremulous, almost incapable of coherent speech, so intense was his agitation, Cooper Edgecombe sent many messages to his loved ones, begging for one word in return, and if nothing less would serve. His voice choked, and only his feverishly burning eyes could say the rest. It was well past sunset ere the youngsters set forth from the rendezvous, accompanied a short distance by both Waldo and the professor, but the parting came in good time. It would be worse than folly to add to the existent perils that of possible discovery by some prowling Aztec who might work serious injury to them one and all. That great bear hide proved a tax upon their strength, even though the bullet-riddled head-piece had been carefully cut off and buried, lest those queer holes tell a risky tale on close examination. But Ixtli, as well as Bruno, was upborne by an exaltation such as neither had known before this hour. There was nothing worse than the natural obstacles in the way to be overcome, and knowing every square yard of ground so thoroughly, Ixtli chose the most practicable route to that hill-encircled town. The stony pass was followed to the lower level, and the young adventurers had drawn fairly near the first buildings, ere encountering a living being, and then ample time was given them for meeting the danger. A low-voiced call sounded upon the night air, and Ixtli responded in much the same tone. Bruno, of course, was utterly in the dark as to what was being said, but he still held perfect faith in his copper-hued guide, and left all to the son of Aztotl. The Aztec brave appeared to be explaining his unusually protracted absence, for he proudly displayed the great grizzly pelt, then exhibited the spearhead from which protruded the tooth-marked wound. Like one who was already familiar with the details, Bruno slowly lounged forward a pace or two, then in silence awaited the pleasure of his companion on that night jaunt. Ixtli was not many minutes in shaking off the Indian, and, almost staggering beneath his shaggy burden, moved away as though in haste to rejoin his family circle. Fortunately for the venture, the Aztecans appeared to believe in the maxim of going to bed early, for there were very few individuals astir at that hour, young though the evening still was, and by the clear moonlight which fell athwart the valley, it was no difficult task to catch sight before being seen, where eyes so busy as those of the two young men were concerned. Only once were they forced to make a brief detour in order to escape meeting another redskin, and then a guarded whisper from the lips of the Aztec warned Bruno that they were almost at the teocalli, wherein the Children of the Sun made their home and abiding place. Leaving the grizzly pelt at a corner for the time being, Ixtli led his white friend up and into the Temple of the Sun, pressing a hand by way of added caution. Although he had declared that an armed guard was kept night and day over the Sun Children, and that he hoped to pass Bruno as well as himself without any serious difficulty, since he had long been a favoured visitor, and ever welcomed by Victo and Glady, the temple was seemingly without such protection upon the present occasion. Ixtli expressed great surprise when this fact became evident, and he showed uneasiness as to the welfare of his beloved patroness and kindly teacher. Surely something evil was impending. His father, Aztotl, was chieftain of the guards and wholly devoted to the Sun Children, ready at all times to risk life in their behalf. Now, if the usual guards were lacking, surely it portended evil, treachery, no doubt, at the bottom of which the paba and the Tzin almost certainly lurked. All this Ixtli contrived to convey to Bruno, who fairly well shared that anxiety, but who was more far going ahead with a bold rush to learn the worst as quickly as might be. Still, unfamiliar with the construction of the temple as he was, Bruno felt helpless without his guide, and so timed his progress by that of Ixtli, right hand tightly gripping the handle of his handwood or maquahuitl, resolved to give a good account of either of those rascally varlets in case trouble lay ahead. The unwonted desolation which appeared to reign on all sides was plainly troubling the Aztec brave, and he seemed to suspect a cunning ambuscade, judging from his slow advance, pausing at nearly every step to bend ear in keen listening. Still, nothing was actually seen or heard until after the young men reached the upper elevation, upon a portion of which the Sun Children had been first sighted by the air voyagers. Here the first sound of human voices was heard, and Bruno stopped short in obedience to the almost fierce grip which Ixtli closed upon his nearest arm, listening for a brief space, then breathing lowly: "We see first. Dat good. Him see first. Dat bad. Eye, ear, to both, you know, brother." "You mean that we are to listen and play spy first, Ixtli?" asked Bruno, scarcely catching the real meaning of those hurried words. "Yes, dat best. Come, step like snowfalls, brother." "Who is it first?" "Victor, she one. Oder man not no sure, but think Huatzin. He bad, all bad. Kill him some day. Dat good. Plenty good all over." This grim vow appeared to do the Aztec good from a mental point of view, and then he led his white friend silently towards the covered part of the teocalli from whence those sounds emanated. Curtains of thick stuff served to shut in the light and to partly smother the sound of voices, but Ixtli cautiously formed a couple of peepholes, of which they quickly made good use. A portion of the sacred fire was burning upon its special altar, while a large lamp, formed of baked clay, was suspended from the roof, shedding a fair light around, as well as perfuming the enclosure quite agreeably. Almost directly beneath this hanging lamp stood the two Children of the Sun, one tall, stately, almost queenly of stature, and now looking unusually impressive, as she seemed to act as shield for her daughter, slighter, more yielding, but ah, how lovely of face and comely of person! Even then, Bruno could not help realizing those facts, although his ears were tingling sharply with the harsh accents falling from a far different pair of lips, those of a tall, muscular warrior, whose form was gorgeously arrayed in featherwork and cunning weaving, rich-hued dyes having been called to aid the other arts as well. If this was actually the Prince Hua, then he was a most brutal sample of Aztecan aristocracy, and at first sight Gillespie felt a fierce hatred for the harsh-toned chieftain. As a matter of course, Bruno was unable to comprehend just what was being said, thanks to his complete ignorance of the language employed, but he felt morally certain that ugly threats were passing through those thin lips, and even so soon his hands began to itch and his blood to glow, both urging him to the rescue. Swiftly fell the reply made by Victo, and her words must have stung the prince to the quick, since he uttered a savage cry, drawing back an arm as though to smite that proudly beautiful face with his hard-clenched fist. That proved to be the capschief, for Bruno could stand no more. He dashed aside the heavy curtain as he leaped forward, giving a stern cry as he came, swinging the war club over his shoulder to strike with all vengeance at the startled and recoiling Aztecan. Only the young man's unfamiliarity with the weapon preserved Prince Hua from certain death. As it was, he reeled, to fall in a nerveless heap upon the floor, while, with a startled cry, another Aztec broke away in flight. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. A Flight Underground of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 23. A Flight Underground. That sudden appearance and flight of another man took Ixtli even more by surprise than it did Bruno, for he never even suspected such a possibility, knowing Prince Hua so well. Still, the young brave was swift to rally, swift to pursue, sending a menace of certain death in case the fleeing cur should not yield himself. Just then Bruno had eyes and thoughts for the Sun Children alone, who quite naturally shrunk back in mingled surprise and alarm at his unceremonious entrance. He forgot his disguise, forgot everything save that before him stood the fair beings whom he had vowed to save at all hazards from what appeared to him worse by far than actual death. Gillespie never knew just what words crossed his lips during those first few seconds, but he saw that the women, in place of eagerly accepting his aid, were visibly shrinking, apparently more alarmed than delighted with the opportunity thus offered. Doubtless this was caused mainly by that odd blending of Aztec and paleface, the color and garb of the one joined to the tongue of the other, but the result might have been even worse, had not Ixtli hastened back to clear up more matters than one. In spite of his utmost efforts, the second Indian had escaped with life, although he received a glancing wound from an arrow as he plunged down towards the lower level, and nothing seemed more certain than that an alarm would right speedily spread throughout the town, if only for the purpose of hurrying succor to the Lord Hua. All this rolled in swift words over Ixtli's lips, his warning finding completion before either of the women could fairly interrupt the young brave. But then the one whom Ixtli termed Victo spoke rapidly in his musical tongue, one strong white hand waving towards the now somewhat embarrassed Gillespie. "He friend, come save you, like save Ixtli," the Aztec hurriedly made reply, with generous tact speaking so that Bruno could comprehend as well as the women. "He good, all good. Papa bad, Tin more bad. Be worse bad if stay here, Victo Glady." Thus given the proper cue, Bruno took fresh courage, and, in as few words as might be, explained his mission. He spoke the name of Cooper Edgecombe, and for the first time that queenly woman showed signs of weakness, staggering back with a faint choking gasp, one hand clasped spasmodically above her madly throbbing heart, the other rising to her temples as though in fear of coming insanity. "He is well. He is safe and longing for his loved ones," Bruno swiftly added, producing the brief note which the exiled aeronaut had pressed into his hand at almost the last moment. "He wrote you that. Here it is, and—" "Make hurry, quick!" sharply interposed Ixtli, as ominous sounds began to arise without the temple of the Sun God. "Dog, get away! Howl for more! Come here, kill like gods be glad!" With an evident effort Victo rallied, tones far from steady, as she begged both young men to save themselves without thought of them. "I thank you. Heaven alone knows how overjoyed I am to hear from my dear husband, my poor child's own father, and he is near too. But go, go! Guide and protect him, Ixtli, for go, I implore you, sir!" "But how? We haven't arranged how you are to be rescued, and I must understand." "Later, then. Another time, through Ixtli," interrupted Mrs. Edgecombe, since there could no longer be a doubt as to her identity. "If found here, it will be our ruin as well as your own. Go, and at once. I fear that Lord Hua may—" "He live yet," pronounced Ixtli, rising from a hasty examination of the fallen chieftain. "Dat bad. Much more worse bad. He dog, all over dog." "And I greatly fear he must have recognized you as one of a foreign race, in spite of your disguise," added the elder woman, trouble in her face, even as it showed in her voice. "He will be wild for revenge, and I fear— Go, and directly, Ixtli!" Bruno Gillespie was only too well assured that this latest fear had foundation on truth. Swiftly though he had wielded the awkward, to him, handwood, Watson had sufficient time to sight his assailant and almost certainly had divined at least a portion of the truth. Doubtless it would have been the more prudent course to repeat that blow with greater precision, but Bruno could not bring himself to do just that, even though the ugly cries were growing in volume on the ground level, and he felt that capture would be but the initial step to death, in all likelihood upon the great stone of sacrifice. Imminent though their peril surely was, Bruno could not betake himself to flight without at least partially performing the duty for which he had volunteered, and so he took time to hurriedly utter: "Watch from the top of the tower for the airship, and be ready to leave at any moment, I implore you, both." For even now his admiring gaze could with difficulty be torn away from yonder younger, even more lovely visage, although as yet the maiden had spoken no word, even shrinking away from this strangely speaking Aztec as though in a fright. "Come, brother, or too late," urged Ixtli, almost sternly. "Save you, or Glass Eyes call Ixtli dog liar. Come, must run, no fight, too big many for that." And so it seemed when the young men rushed away from the lighted interior and gained the uncovered space beyond. Loud cries came soaring through the night from different directions, and dim, phantom-like shapes could be glimpsed in hurrying confusion. Apparently the majority only knew that trouble of some description was brewing, and that the centre of interest was either in or near the temple of the sun god, yet that was more than sufficient to place the white intruder in great peril, despite the elaborate disguise he wore. Then, with awful abruptness, there came a sound which could only be likened to rolling thunder by one uninitiated, but which caused Ixtli to shrink and almost cower, ere gasping: "The great war drum! Now must go! Sacrifice if caught! Come, white brother, see dat more bad now!" Those mighty throbs rolled and reverberated from the hills, filling the night air with waves of thunder, none the less awe-inspiring now that their true import was realized. The entire population was aroused, and each building seemed to cast forth an armed host, while as through some magic touch a circle of fire sprung on all sides, beginning to illumine both valley and barrier. Bruno stood like one appalled, really fascinated by this transformation scene for which he had been so poorly prepared, but Ixtli better comprehended their situation, and gripping an arm he muttered hastily: "Come, brother, stop more make too late. Must hide now. Dat stop go back way came. Come." Bruno roused himself with an effort, then yielded to the Aztec's guidance, crouching low as the brief bit of clear moonlight had to be traversed. Instead of making for the steps, which as customary reached from terrace to terrace at each corner, Ixtli crept to the centre, where the temple side was cast into deepest shadow, then lowered himself by his arms to drop silently to the broad path below. A whispered word urged Bruno to imitate this action, and those friendly hands caught and steadied Gillespie as he took the drop. And so, one after another, the mighty steps were passed, both young men reaching the ground at the same instant, having succeeded in leaving the temple of the sun god without being glimpsed by an Indian of all those whom the sonorous drum throbs had brought forth in arms. "Whither now?" asked Bruno in guarded tones, as he looked forth from shadow into moonlight, seeing scores upon scores of armed shapes flitting to and fro, all looking for the enemy, yet none able to precisely locate the trouble. Just then a savage yell broke from the top of the temple, followed by a few fierce-sounding sentences, which Ixtli declared came from the Lord Hua, then adding: "He say kill if catch, but dat no, come white brother, Ixtli show how play fool dat dog, yes." "All right, my hearty. Is it a break for the hills? I reckon I can break through. If not, well, I'll leave some marks behind me, anyway." "No, no, dat bad. Can't go to hills, must hide," positively declared the young Aztec. "Come now, me show good place. All dead but we." Evidently trusting to pass undetected where so many others were rushing back and forth in seeming confusion, Ixtli broke away from the shadow of the temple, closely followed by Gillespie, heading as directly as might be for the strange refuge which he now had in mind. That proved to be a low, unpretending structure, which was of no great extent, so far as Bruno's hasty look could ascertain. Still, that was not the time for doubting the wisdom of his guide, nor a moment in which to discuss either methods or means, and as Ixtli passed through a massive entrance, the paleface followed, giving a little shiver as the barrier swung to behind them. "What sort of a place is it, anyway, Ixtli?" he demanded, but the Aztec was too hurried for words just then, save enough to warn his companion in peril that they must descend deeper into the earth. It was more of a scramble than a deliberate descent, for the gloom was complete, and Bruno had no time in which to feel for steps or stairs. Only for the aiding touch of his guide, he must have taken more than one awkward tumble ere that lower level was attained. Then a breathing spell was granted him, and, while Ixtli bent ear in listening to discover if pursuit was being made, Bruno drew a match from the liberal supply he had taken the precaution to fetch along, and striking it, held aloft the tiny torch to view their present surroundings, only to give an involuntary start and cry as he caught indistinct glimpses of fleshless bones and grinning skulls, those grim relics of mortality showing upon every side as his wild eyes roved around. Then a hand struck down the match, and a swift voice breathed, "They come this way. See us hide. Come hunt. Now to kill." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. The Sun Children's Peril of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 24. The Sun Children's Peril. Not until the two young men passed beneath those heavy curtains did either one of the Sun Children really give thought to their own possible peril, but stood close together, arm of mother about daughter, as they listened to the ominous sounds without, so rapidly growing in force and number. Then, just as the deep tones of the war drum boomed forth upon the night air, the fallen Aztec betrayed signs of rallying wits, giving a low sound which might have been groan of pain or curse of baffled rage. Be that as it may, the sound served one purpose. Victoria Edgecombe, to append her correct name for the first time, drew her child farther away, her right hand reaching forth to pluck a light yet effective spear from where it lay against the wall. "Mother! Mother!" faintly panted the maiden, plainly at a loss to comprehend all that had so recently transpired. "What is it? What does it all mean? Surely that was Ixtli, and the other—" "A messenger from your father, child, and—" "My father! I thought he is not dead!" "Thanks be to heaven, not dead!" with hysterical joy, in face as in voice. "Alive and seeking us, Gladys, coming to rescue us from this death in life, and now, to your knees, my daughter, to thy knees, and lift thanks unto the good Father who has at last listened to my moans." Again the war drum boomed forth in an awesome roll, but all unheeding that ominous sound, paying no attention to the stirring of yonder savage, whose lacerated scalp was painting his face a deeper red than even nature intended, mother and daughter sank to their knees, lifting hands and hearts towards the All-Powerful, even as their gratitude floated towards the throne of grace. Then arose the hoarse tones of Huatzin, bidding his allies find and slay without mercy, cursing the treacherous Aztec who had thus guided one of a strange tribe into the very heart of their beloved city. With a short, fierce ejaculation, Victo sprang to her feet, right hand once again grasping shaft of javelin, its copper point gleaming rudely in the rays of lamp, as though already moistened by the heart-blood of yonder villain. Far differently acted the maiden, her figure trembling with fear and wonder commingled, her lips slightly blanched, as she clung closer to her mother. Yet through all ran a touch of girlish curiosity, which helped shape the words now crossing her lips. "Who was it, mother? Who could the stranger be? And whither has he gone?" "With Ixtli, my child, and may the good God of our own people grant them both life and liberty. If I thought your father, Gladys, alive and looking for his beloved ones. See, from his own dear hand, and he says hold, who comes there?" But the alarm appeared to be without actual foundation, for the sounds came no closer, remaining beyond the drapery past which Lord Hua had staggered only a few brief seconds before. Gladys rallied more speedily than one might have expected, and she spoke with even greater interest than at first. "My dear father? And alive? Oh, mother, why is he not here too? Why should he send another? And that one, he spoke our dear language, mother. Surely he is not as Ixtli." "No, he was of our own people, child, and I can hardly conceive how he came hither, save that Ixtli must have acted as guide." "And those awful warriors," shivering as the war cries followed the muffled roar of the great drum. "If found, he will be slain." "Do you think there is any hope for him, mother? And he seemed so. "He is gone with Ixtli, and Ixtli is true to the very core," Victo hastened to give assurance. "I would rather trust him than many another of thrice his years and warlike experience. Ixtli is true, ay, as true and tried as his father, Aztotl." "Who loves you, mother, and would win—" "Hush, child!" just a bit sharply interposed the elder woman, yet at the same time tightening that loving clasp, "merely as the daughter of his sun god, Quetzalcoatl, and ha!" Once again there came the echoes of rapid footfalls beyond the heavy draperies, and again this Amazonian mother drew her superb form in front of her shrinking child, poising the javelin in readiness for stroke or casting as might serve best. A strong arm brushed the curtains aside sufficiently to admit its owner's passage, but the armed warrior stopped short at sighting the Sun Children, his proud head lowering, hands crossing over his broad bosom in token of adoration, for it surely was more than mere submission to one held his superior. With a low cry, Victo drew back a bit, weapon lowering as she recognized friend in place of enemy. "It is you, Aztotl?" she spoke in mellow tones. "I thought, did you remove the usual guards this evening?" "The blame falls to my share, Sun-Child," the Red Heron made answer, with a meekness strange in one of his build and general appearance, that of a king among ordinary warriors. "Not justly, nor through fault of your own, my good and true friend," the elder woman made haste to give assurance. "Not even thy lips shall speak slander of Aztotl, the true heart, my brother." With a swift advance, the Red Heron caught the unarmed hand to bend over it until his lips barely brushed the soft, perfumed skin. Then he sank to one knee, bowing his head until his brow touched the floor beneath her sandaled feet. Swiftly, gracefully these movements were made, and where they would have appeared fulsome or degraded in some, with this warrior the effect was far from disagreeable to see or to experience. Victo flushed warmly and drew back a little farther, for the memory of those words let fall by Gladys came back with unpleasant distinctness. And was she so certain that Aztotl looked upon her as merely a god-descended priestess? The Red Heron arose easily, head rising proudly above his shapely shoulders as he met those great blue eyes, eyes as pure and as fathomless as the cloudless sky in midsummer. And then, more like one giving a bare statement of facts than one offering a defence for himself, Aztotl spoke of a faithless subordinate who was guilty of either careless neglect or worse. "It may be that Tezcatl lost his wits through strong waters, Sun-Child, or even that he took evil pay from still more vile hands. You have seen the last of him, though, child of Quetzalcoatl." "You surely do not mean that—" Aztotl lightly tapped the knife hilt showing above his maxtlatl, coldly adding words to that significant gesture. "There is no place for fool or traitor upon the bodyguard of the Sun Children. Tezcatl sinned, he has paid full forfeit, and just so shall all others perish who dare cast an evil glance towards— Ha!" Another outcry arose from the other side of the curtained recess, and the red heron instantly sprang away in that direction, hands gripping weapons in readiness for instant use in case of need. Almost as swiftly, Victo and the maiden followed, one through fear, the other through utter lack of fear for herself. Those savage cries came from the lips of none other than the chieftain, whose now bare head bore significant traces of Bruno Gillespie's handiwork, and he seemed bent on rushing directly into the presence of the Sun Children, until Red Heron interposed, stern and icy-toned. "Stand back, my Lord Hua," he ordered, left hand advanced with open palm, but its dexter mate armed and ready for hot work if that must come. "Venture no closer on thy peril, chief." Huatzin recoiled a bit, though that might have been more through surprise than because he feared this proud warrior. He gripped his knife hilt and partly drew the blade from its supporting sash. A hissing oath escaped his lips, and he crouched a trifle, as a wild beast gathers its deadliest force prior to making a death leap. "Darest thou bar my path, Aztotl?" he cried hoarsely. "Make way, I bid thee! Make way, for I will see the Sun Children, and—" "Not so, my Lord Hua," coldly interrupted the master of guards, that warning palm still turned to the front. "You are here without law or leave, and know what the edict says. From the going to the return of the sun, these stones are sacred from all feet save those of the Sun Children and their regular bodyguard." "What care I for laws, or for such as thou, Red Heron? I will that such a thing shall be, and it comes to pass. And thou dare to bar my way, Aztotl?" "Ay, by words if they prove sufficient, by force if called for, by death if worst must come. Even the death of a mighty chieftain like Lord Hua would not be too great a feat." For a brief space it seemed as though Huatzin would make a leap to which there would be but one termination, death to one or to both. But Aztotl coldly spoke on. "I have given you fair and friendly warning, Lord Hua. Go now, while the path of peace lies open. Go, else I sound the call, and my guard will take you in charge, just as they would any other rascally intruder." "Your precious son, for instance," retorted the Tzin viciously. "He came with one of a different race from our own, Aztotl, a traitor in thine own family, yet thou darest hint at—" Aztotl lifted a bent finger to his lips, sounding a shrill, far-penetrating whistle. The response was prompt indeed, an armed force advancing with weapons held ready, awaiting only word from commander to punish that rash intruder by hurling him to death over the terraces. Although nearly beside himself with fury, Huatzin glared defiance at both guard and its commander, then turned more directly upon the Sun Children, speaking in savage tones. "Unto you, proud Victo, I'll either win you as my—" "Go on, Lord Hua," coldly spoke the woman as his voice choked. "I'll win and wear you as my squaw, or else give you to the stone of sacrifice," he snarled, then turned away as Aztotl motioned his guards to clear the temple of all intruders, then see that none other dared enter. End of chapter 24. Waldo Goes Fishing of the Lost City. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 25. Waldo Goes Fishing. It was with stronger forebodings than he dared acknowledge even to himself that Professor Featherwit watched the two young men out of sight in the early gloom, and scarcely had his nephew passed beyond hearing than Uncle Phaeton would gladly have recalled Bruno. Waldo made light of all fears, prophesying complete success, and even going so far as to predict Bruno's return accompanied by the Children of the Sun, enthusiastic words which set the exile to trembling with excess of joy and anticipation. What then was the blank dismay of all when, floating through the night, came the hollow throbbing of yonder mighty war-drum, fetching each person to his feet and holding him spellbound for the first few seconds. Cooper Edgecombe turned sick at heart, even while ignorant as to the method of sending forth that alarm, his hollow groan being the first sound to follow the simultaneous exclamation which burst from 3 pairs of lips as the surprise came. And but a breath later, Waldo broke forth with the excited query: "What is it? What's broken loose now? Surely thunder!" Only Professor Phaeton at once recognized the sound, through description, and each one of those swiftly succeeding strokes seemed falling upon his heart, bidding him mourn for his beloved nephew, upon whom his aged eyes had surely looked their last in this life. Yet it was the professor who took prompt action, speaking sharply as he darted across to where the airship rested. "Come, get aboard, and let us do what lies in our power. It was criminal to send the poor lad into the jaws of death, but now hasten, there may be a chance even yet." The call was still hot upon his lips when his 2 companions entered the aerostat, gripping tight the handrail as Professor Featherwit sent the vessel afloat with reckless haste. As by a miracle, they escaped disaster through rushing into a bushy tree-top, and that fact served to steady the aeronaut's nerves. "On guard, Uncle Phaeton!" cried Waldo, making a lucky snatch at his cap, which one of the stiff boughs brushed off his head. "Aye, aye, lad!" responded the men at the guiding gear, as the airship shot onward and upward, now heading, as directly as was practicable, for the lost city of the Aztecs. "That was the very lesson I needed. I am steady of nerve now, and will show no lack. Heaven grant that we may not be forever too late, though." "What do you reckon could have kicked up such a bobbery, uncle? And what— Ugh!" as the war-drum's throbbings again swelled forth in grim alarm. "What in time is that, anyway?" As briefly as might be, the professor explained, and almost for the first time Waldo felt a thrill of dread. "If they've got Bruno, what will they do with him?" That very dread was worrying uncle Phaeton, and already through his busy brain were flashing horrid pictures of punishment and sacrifice, of hideous scenes of torture, wherein the eldest son of his dead sister played a prominent role perforce. He dared not trust his tongue to make answer just then, and sent the aeromotor onward at top speed, leaning far forward to win the earliest glimpse of what? He caught sight of blazing beacons fairly encircling the lost city, forming a cordon through which no stranger could hope to pass unseen. He beheld hundreds of armed shapes rushing to and fro, plainly looking for some intruder or other enemy, yet almost as certainly failing as yet to make the longed-for discovery. Not until that moment had uncle Phaeton dared indulge in even the shadow of a hope. The awful alarm seemed proof conclusive that poor Bruno had been taken through the treachery of Ixtli. Naturally enough, that was his first belief, but now, as the airship slackened pace to circle more deliberately above the valley, all eyes on the eager watch for either Bruno or something to hint at his fate, Professor Featherwit lost a portion of that conviction. If Bruno had indeed fallen victim to misplaced confidence, and had been craftily lured into this den of ravening wild beasts, why all this confusion and mad scurry? Why had not the traitor first made sure of his victim? Why such a general alarm? Although such haste in getting afloat had been made, some little time had been thus consumed, and before the aerostat was fairly above the lost city, Bruno and Ixtli had dropped by stages down the shadowed side of the temple of the sun god, to burrow underneath the ground as their surest method of eluding pursuit. Only for that, the end might have been different, for, once sighted, Gillespie would have been rescued by his friends, or those friends would surely have shared death with him. And so it came to pass that, circle though they might, calling ears to supplement their eyes, swooping perilously low down in their fierce eagerness to sight their imperilled one, never a glimpse of the young man could they obtain, nor even a definite hint as to where next to look for him. "Surely they cannot have captured Bruno as yet," huskily muttered uncle Phaeton, hungrily straining his eyes without reward. If the poor boy had actually fallen into such evil hands, why such crazy confusion? Why, oh, why did I permit his coaxings to overpower my better judgment? Why did I send him into—" The words stuck in his throat and refused to issue. Phaeton Featherwit just then felt himself little less than a cold-blooded assassin. Mr. Edgecombe was but little less deeply stirred, although his feelings were more of a mixture. He grieved for Bruno, and would willingly risk his life in hopes of doing the young man a service, yet his gaze was drawn far more frequently towards yonder temple, on the top of which surely he had caught sight of his wife, his daughter. "Let me down, and try to find him," he eagerly begged, as one might plead for a great boon. "I promise to save him, if yet alive, and let me try, Professor, I beg of you to give me this chance to show my heartfelt gratitude." But Professor Featherwit shook his head in negation. "That would only add to our trouble, friend. Knowing nothing of the dialect, you would be wholly at a loss, and, looking so entirely different in every respect, how could you hope to pass inspection?" "All seems so confused, that I might. Surely it is worth trying." "It would be suicidal, so say no more on that score." Almost harshly spoke the usually mild-mannered aeronaut, sending his vessel upon another circuit, only with stern vigilance choking back the appealing shout to his lost nephew. This time the aerostat was brought directly above the Temple of the Sun, where there appeared to be some unusual disturbance, a number of armed guards fairly driving a gaily arrayed Indian down to the lower levels, and that greatly against his inclinations, judging from the harsh cries and ringing threats which burst from his lips. Recognizing the building, and unable to hold his intense emotions longer under stern control, Cooper Edgecombe called aloud the names of his wife and daughter, begging that they might come to him, but then the airship was sent onward and upward with a dizzying swoop, and Professor Featherwit gripped an arm, sternly speaking. "Quiet, sir! Another outbreak like that, and I'll lock your lips if I have to send a bullet through your mad brain." "I forgot. I could not wait longer, knowing that my loved ones—" "You forgot that the lives of all depend upon our remaining at liberty," coldly interrupted Featherwit. "Without this means of conveyance, how can your loved ones escape? Now, your solemn pledge to maintain utter silence, or I will take you back to yonder wilderness, leaving you to shift for yourself as best you can. Promise, sir!" "I will, I do. Forgive me, for I was carried away by— 'Twas there I saw— After so many horrible years," huskily muttered the exile, fairly cowering there before his saviour from the whirlpool. "Enough. Bear in mind that the rescue of your loved ones depend on our efforts. If discovered by yonder snarling beasts, and the machine is injured, farewell all hopes. Now, quiet, and look for Bruno." Again the airship circled over the valley, in spite of the moonlight, passing wholly unseen and unsuspected by the Aztecs, whose energies were bent on ferreting out mortal foes, not demons of the upper world. Waldo leaned farther over the handrail as they floated closer to an excited group of warriors, the central figure being Lord Hua himself, fiercely denouncing Aztotl and his son Ixtli as traitors to the common welfare, and calling upon all honest braves to mete forth befitting punishment. Professor Featherwit caught one name indistinctly, that of the young Aztec in whose company Bruno had set forth on his ill-starred venture, and hoping to learn more of importance, he caused the aerostat to hover directly above that particular group of redskins. Waldo, never stopping to count the risk he might thus fetch upon them all, silently lowered the grapnel by means of the drag-rope, giving a boyish chuckle as the three-pronged hook descended amidst that gathering, the sight causing more than one superstitious brave to leap aside with cries of amazed affright. The airship gave a sudden swoop, and the grapnel caught Watson by his girdle, jerking him fairly off his feet and swinging him into air, pretty much as a youngster might land a writhing fish. But no fish ever sent forth so wild a screech of mingled rage and terror as split the air just then. Although hardly realizing what was happening, Professor Featherwit sent the aeromotor upward with a mighty jerk. The shock proving too much for that sash, Lord Hua fell back to earth, literally biting the dust, although he met with no bodily harm beyond sundry bruises. "Caught a sucker, and I'll never do it again, uncle!" exploded Waldo, as he swiftly hauled in his novel fish-line, but he had to take a severe lecture from the professor before the subject was finally dropped. And, worse than all else, the air demon was now the target for both eyes and arrows, and, perforce, sailed swiftly away into the night. End of chapter 25. Down Among the Dead. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Lost City by Joseph E. Badger, Jr. Chapter 26. Down Among the Dead. Ixtli spoke with a degree of earnestness which left no room for doubt, even if the young man's own keen sense of hearing had not given warning but an instant later. Ominous sounds came from the entrance, which had served them but so brief a time gone by, and Bruno knew that, even if they had escaped being seen while thus attempting to win such a gruesome refuge, the possibility of their having elected just such a line of flight had occurred to some of the redskins. Gillespie heard the heavy doors open, then clang to again. He was fairly confident that some of the Aztecs had entered, although as yet the utter darkness hindered further recognition. "What next, Ixtli?" he whispered, lips almost touching the face of his young guide, as they stood close together in the murk. "They can't take me alive. Is it fight or—" "No fight yet," gently breathed the Aztec in turn. "They look. Dat not make sure find. They try see. We try not see all time. They come, we go, like this." Catching a hand within his own clasp, Ixtli led Bruno away in that utter darkness, seemingly well acquainted with the lay of the ground, although it quickly became evident that there must be more than one direct passage. Bruno felt convinced that there were other chambers turning at right angles to their present course, though it might have bothered the young man to give entirely satisfactory reasons for such a belief. Ixtli did not flee fast nor far, in that first spurt pausing shortly to turn face towards the rear, a low musical chuckle coming through his lips. "They come look. Got no eyes for seeing dark," he explained, barely loud enough for Bruno to catch his meaning. "We play fool dem all. Dat be fun. Heap fun all time over." Ixtli was scarcely as precise of speech while under the influence of excitement as when he had ample time in which to pick and choose his words, but there was little room for mistaking his meaning, which, after all, is fairly sufficient. But this time the young brave was in error, for only a few moments later both fugitives caught sight of a dim light in hurried motion far towards the entrance to these underground crypts. That warned them of added peril, and Ixtli's chuckle died abruptly away. "They'll fetch us now," grimly muttered Bruno, shaking his fairly athletic shoulders and fingering the knife at his belt as though making preparations for an inevitable struggle. "All right. They may kill, but I'll furnish some red paint for my tombstone, anyway." It may be doubted whether Ixtli fully appreciated this conclusion, yet he divined something of what was spoken, and made swift response. "No kill yet. They look. We hide. Maybe not find. Maybe play fool all over, yes." "Where can we hide that lights won't ferret us out, though? If a fellow might only have the same advantage, here in this darkness I'm not worth a sick kitten." Just a bit disgustedly came the words, but Bruno was not giving over in weak despair. No matter how vast the odds might show against him, he would put up a gallant fight as long as he could lift his hand or strike a blow. Still, he was by no means anxious for the crisis to arrive. He would far rather run than fight, under existing circumstances, but whither and how? Ixtli took it upon himself to solve the perplexing enigma, in a whisper bidding his white brother to follow with as little sound as might be, once more hurrying away through the gloomy blackness, which was by no means rendered more agreeable to Bruno by that fleeting glimpse of the dead men's bones. There was little room left for doubting the truth. Their presence in the death cells surely was more than suspected, judging from the actions of yonder redskins, who flashed the light over and into each angle and corner, each niche and jog, where a human being might possibly seek concealment. They were not so many in number, but still a larger force than could well be met with success by two youths, even granting that Ixtli would turn lethal weapons against his own people, which Bruno felt was by no means a settled fact. For some little time the young man kept without that limited circle of light, watching each movement made by the searchers, and at the same time taking care that none of the little party stole a dangerous march upon them by hastening in advance of the lights. Ixtli apparently enjoyed the affair much as a child might a successful game of I spy, for he emitted occasional chuckles and let fall soft whispers which, if caught by other ears, certainly would not have deeply benefited the fugitives when captured. Thanks to that slow progress rendered thus by the care and minuteness of the search, Bruno began to marvel at the extent of the catacombs, and almost involuntarily calculate how many centuries it must have taken to accumulate such enormous quantities of remains. For, thanks to yonder prying light, he could see how high those grim relics of perishing mortality were piled up in tiers, with here and there upright skeletons in position of greater prominence. Perhaps Gillespie might have been better able to appreciate Ixtli's amusement had he even an inkling as to how this game of hide and go seek was fated to end. That an end must come, eventually, was a foregone conclusion. And then he ventured to ask Ixtli how they were to escape detection when they could retreat no farther, but before an answer could be fairly shaped, that end seemed actually upon them. Without sound or warning of any sort, another bright light showed at a considerable distance in the opposite direction, and as Bruno stared that way, he made out several armed warriors who appeared to be engaged in that same occupation, searching that city of the dead for the living. Thus caught between two fires, there seemed only one course to pursue, and with the courage of his fathers, Bruno spoke in low, grim tones to his young guide. "No use for you to join in the mix, Ixtli. I'll do the best I know how, but if I can't make the riffle, if I go down for good and all, I ask you to convey the news to my friends." "You will?" But Ixtli was not at the end of his resources, and gripping a wrist, he urged Bruno towards yonder second light, speaking hastily as they moved along towards the edge of that wide passage. "No fight yet. Best hide. Maybe no find. Dat best try first. Den Ixtli fight like white brother, fast." There was time for scant speech, for just then the two parties seemed for the first time to catch sight of each other, and while the brave bearing the rude lantern still maintained his slow movements, searching well as he came, the other Indians came in advance, giving the fugitives barely time in which to crouch down under temporary cover. The moment these enemies had passed them by, Ixtli urged Bruno on, then in swift whispers instructed him how to perfect his hiding, even aiding the young paleface into one of the upright crypts, back of a grim skeleton, the mouldering blankets assisting in covering the one of flesh and blood. After like fashion, the Aztecs sought cover on the opposite side of the passage. None too quickly either, for now the single searcher drew dangerously nigh, peering into every practicable hiding place on either side before moving onward. Little by little he drew closer, while the other band of searchers apparently turned off into a side passage, or large chamber, since nothing could be seen or heard of them by the fugitives. In all probability, Ixtli's bold ruse would have proved a complete success, for the Aztec warrior showed no suspicion as he drew nearer, but it was not to be thus. Fairly holding his breath, lest he disturb some of the dry bones immediately in front of himself, Bruno waited and hoped, only to feel his blood chill and his heart fail him, as a sickening horror crept over his brain, nor was that the only creeping thing, worse luck. Past all room for doubting, his entrance into that crypt had disturbed the repose of a snake of some description, for now he could feel the loathsome reptile crawling slowly up his back, turning the skin beneath to scorching ice in its horrid passage. One horrible nightmare minute that lasted, then the serpent paused upon his shoulder and biceps, touching his cheek with nose, then drawing back its ugly head to give an ominous hiss. Human flesh and blood could endure no more, and Bruno flung the snake violently off, striking forcibly against that mass of dry bones as he did so. With a rattling clatter, the skeleton lost its frail coherence, and tumbled outward, leaving Bruno fairly exposed within the niche. With a cry, the Aztec warrior turned in that direction, but ere he could fetch his light to bear upon the right spot, Ixtli sprung forth to the rescue, hooting like a frightened owl as he dashed the light to earth, and at the same time deftly tripping the Indian headlong. Swift as thought itself, he followed up the advantage thus won, smiting the fallen brave heavily upon the crown with a clubbed thigh bone, depriving him of sensibility for the time being at least, and then snatching up the still burning light, he called in guarded tones to his white friend. "Come, brother, play hunt now. Fast, not stop here. Dat bad for you, see by dem so soon. Dat good you go, like dis way." Scarcely realizing just what fresh ruse the Aztec had in mind, but far from recovered from that horrible fear of death from poisonous fangs, Gillespie submitted, Ixtli hurrying him away, turning off into what appeared to be a side passage, less spacious than that to which they had until then confined their retreat. The young Aztec hastily explained his present scheme, which was to play the role of searchers as well, and scarcely had he made that project known, than another difficult test was offered their courage. End of chapter 26.